Let's talk about etiquette in Colombia. Hi all, I'm Isrado and you're watching my travel channel where I talk all things Colombia. So I think one of the things that can catch us off guard more than anything else when traveling to a country is etiquette. It's very easy to take cultural customs from your home country for granted, as by the time you're an adult, they generally tend to be embedded fairly deep into your psyche, I reckon. If you're not very consciously aware of this though, it can cause some problems when traveling to other countries, as all of a sudden you're amidst a totally different culture with totally different customs that may often seem counterintuitive to what you're used to. You might find yourself getting frustrated when people just don't see things the same way you do, even if your perspective on something is so intuitively obvious to you that it feels redundant to even think about. Of course, on the flip side, you might also have some pleasant surprises. Maybe people are more conscious of something that you'd never thought to pay much mind towards before, but you quickly grow to appreciate, like for instance if people are more attentive to each other than you're used to. Well, all that said, I wanted to take a look today at some of the cultural customs you can expect to experience in Colombia, along with some practices for how best to relate to Colombians with your own etiquette. Now, one thing to know here is that Colombia is a very culturally diverse country, and by that I don't mean that it's got a diverse international community, because let's face it, it's mostly just Yanks and Venezuelans. What I mean is that within Colombian culture itself, there is some heavy variation in culture. People on the Atlantic coast, for instance, can be very different to, say, people in the country's Andean range. There are definitely a lot of customs that are a bit more exclusive to specific regions, so with that in mind, I thought I'd just focus on some of the broader things that do seem to be more common throughout the country. Alright then, so with that in mind, I personally believe that the golden value throughout Colombia that most other values fall into is politeness. Now, this might sound kind of broad and vague, so what exactly do I mean by this? Well, see, in Colombia, people almost always like to keep interactions with each other very cordial. It's true that Colombians are often known to be very friendly people, and in many cases this can compel them to greet each other with a lot of affection. I do, however, think that there's a bit more to it here. See, one thing I've come to learn about Colombians is that they can often be highly averse to any kind of conflict. That might sound pretty normal. I mean, most people don't tend to love conflict, but in Colombia I would say that the aversion to it is a bit more extreme. I find that if people are bothered or even upset by something in Colombia, it's quite often the case that they'll try and keep it to themselves, at least until it becomes too much to bear. Until that point though, they put quite a concerted effort into staying level-headed. Again, that might sound normal anyway, but I'd say the difference is that Colombians are just extra cautious about it. They'll often tiptoe very lightly around anything that even has the slightest potential to result in conflict. You could consider this as one of the primary reasons for their politeness, so hey, maybe conflict aversion should be the main umbrella value here. You could sort of look at it as a form of stoicism, where expressing your vexations is generally frowned upon. It's not entirely unlike the brand of stoicism you sometimes see in England, although the circumstances that brought those cultural tendencies about are probably quite different. I don't want to speculate too much on how this came to be in Colombia, as I may be speaking beyond my pay grade, but if I were to hazard a guess, I feel like it may at least in part come from the historical desire for peace and harmony amidst many centuries of political and social conflict. Even if current generations aren't living through the same level of turmoil compared to their ancestors, this peacekeeping attitude can become part of the culture as they get passed down through generations of families, which might explain why it's still common today. Whatever the case, the end result of conflict aversion is that people really value being polite, no matter how they're truly feeling. Just one example of this is that Colombians will often avoid saying no to things, as it's seen as a bit too confrontational. Instead, it's common to look for less direct ways of saying this, like maybe suggesting an alternative or giving more of a neutral, non-committal response. Of all the ways Colombians avoid confrontation, I would argue that the aversion to saying no is probably the most common thing you'll come across, so be sure to keep that in mind if you ever find yourself asking people for favours. Even if you only notice a little bit of hesitance in the words they use, there's a good chance that they're really just trying to say no to you. If you can pick up on that and not push any further, Colombians really appreciate that, so that's something to remember. Now for many watching, you might be thinking, wait, I thought Latin Americans are known to be super vibrant and expressive and full of emotion and passion. So why are you insinuating that Colombians are in fact mild-tempered and standoffish? Well, to be honest, as contradictory as these things seem to each other, I'd actually concede that they're all true at the same time. Colombia is definitely a very vibrant country, full of people who love to express themselves and their passion for their culture, but they also put a lot of value in social harmony and can be very cautious about the image they put out to others. Because of this, the way Colombians express themselves can be very dependent on context. For instance, if you're walking down the street on any given day in Colombia, you're likely going to get a strong whiff of the cultural vibrancy with every street vendor you pass who's loudly and rapidly calling out their wares like some 1920s spruiker. If you go to any restaurant, there's a good chance that they'll have some highly impassioned vallenato or cumbia playing, and in some venues you'll even find people engaging in some traditional dancing with their partners. You'll also have your fair share of loquacious taxi or Uber drivers who seem to have an inconceivable amount of social energy. Those are just a few examples of how lively Colombians can be, and that's without even mentioning the soccer, as I'm sure you can imagine what that's like. As common as all of this is though, it can all look quite different in other contexts. If you were to look at how people talk to each other, for instance, there's definitely a lot of subtle, even-tempered social cues that they employ in order to avoid potential confrontations with each other. This is even more so the case when it comes to formal interactions, like with bosses, customers, or strangers, for example. If you go to eat at a dine-in restaurant, for instance, be it casual or formal, you may often find that the waiters and waitresses are very noticeably on their best behaviour, and particularly scrupulous in making sure everything's okay for you. And no, this isn't because they want a tip, as unlike in the US, their income isn't reliant on this. So yeah, this perceived dichotomy between lively and even-tempered expression can be a bit confusing at first, but one of the key things to recognise is that, regardless of how they may express themselves, Colombians are still often very sensitive people who feel things very deeply. They may be mild-tempered, cool, and collected in how they communicate, but this isn't necessarily indicative of how they may be truly feeling. On the contrary, in tough situations, they may be really suppressing some intense emotions to uphold their standards of social etiquette. Once again, it's really important therefore that we as expats and tourists don't take advantage of Colombians and their kindness. Obviously that's a good rule with anyone, but with Colombians, I'd argue that you need to be even more careful about this. You shouldn't assume that anything goes for them just because they rarely seem to push back. Even if they have some inner hesitance or turbulence over a situation, they might not directly express this to you. If you fail to recognise this though and you continue to take advantage of their cordiality, they may eventually reach a breaking point. After all, as humans, we can only hide our frustrations for so long, no matter how determined we are. Of course, the longer you hide them, the more negative energy you're storing up, so if you do wait a long time before releasing it, well, it's not going to be pretty. When you add to that the fact that, in addition to this, Colombians are also very sensitive to their emotions, as I said before, well, you have a recipe for quite the volcanic outburst once it all becomes too much to bear. If you haven't been paying attention, this may seem a bit uncharacteristic and tempestuous for the otherwise easygoing people you thought you knew, but if you keep in mind everything I've just mentioned, it does begin to make sense. So with that in mind, the practical takeaway for expats and tourists would be this. If you find yourself asking Colombians for favours or anything that may have the potential to cause friction, try and approach it with genuine kindness and gentleness. You don't have to avoid these situations altogether, but just try and be respectful. If you're asking for something that could inconvenience them, it can be good to double or triple check with them to ensure that they really are okay with it, as otherwise they may not say anything. Now obviously if someone's wronged you in some serious way, then it's totally fine to be stern with them, like I'm not saying you should be a pushover, but in the situations where you're the one initiating something that may potentially bother them, that's where you should tread a bit more lightly. Then the second thing to be aware of here is how they respond. If you notice a bit of hesitance or reluctance, that may be a sign you should back away from the subject. Again, in many contexts, it's quite unlikely that you'll get a very direct no, nor are they likely to express their full thoughts about something if they consider it to be combative. Again, there may be some more subtle social cues like suggesting alternatives or giving a more neutral response, as I mentioned earlier. Anyway, I think you get the idea at this point. Basically, you want to try and be in tune with the people you're hanging around and where they're at as much as you can, so that you don't make any of these accidental missteps. So yeah, I hope that gives you a good idea of what you can expect to experience from other people in Colombia, and the kind of etiquette you should be putting out to others for the best experience. I do want to make the disclaimer here though that everything I've described about Colombians in this video isn't applicable to everyone in the country. That may sound obvious, but I think it's important to not set unrealistic expectations. The reality is that whilst a lot of this stuff is certainly widespread in the cultural zeitgeist, that doesn't mean that it's ubiquitous in any absolute sense. Let's be honest, life is never that simple, and so you'll almost certainly still come across plenty of people who don't abide by common societal decorum. That's not to say that these social values don't exist, just that there are always going to be exceptions. Anyway, with that, I'm going to wrap it up here. Obviously, there are other social customs in Colombia that I could discuss, but for today, I just wanted to focus on politeness, so again, hope you learned something. If you enjoyed this, feel free to like, subscribe, hit the bell, and if you like, you can leave a video topic suggestion. Until next time though, thanks for watching. Ciao!